Have you ever eaten a big bowl of white rice, a plate of pasta, or a sweet pastry, felt fine for 20 minutes, and then hit a wall of sleepiness an hour later, followed by hunger that shows up way too soon? That crash is not a willpower problem. It is your blood sugar doing exactly what a certain kind of carbohydrate is built to make it do. Carbohydrates get blamed and praised in equal measure, but most of that debate skips a basic fact. Not all carbs behave the same way once they hit your bloodstream. The difference between a food that keeps you steady for hours and one that wrecks your energy an hour later usually comes down to one thing: how processed that carbohydrate was before it reached your plate. Here is what this video will cover. First, what carbohydrates actually are, because carbs is really two very different things bundled into one word. Second, why refining grains, meaning stripping and grinding them, changes how your body responds to them, and why that response varies a lot between people and even between activities. Third, practical ways to eat carbohydrates so you get steady energy instead of a spike and a crash. Let's get into it. What carbs really are. When people say carbs, they usually picture bread, rice, sugar, maybe fruit. But nutritionally, carbohydrate is an umbrella term for two components that behave completely differently in your body: sugars, which include starches and simple sugars, and fiber. Sugars and starches are what your body breaks down into glucose, the fuel that raises your blood sugar. Fiber is different. Your digestive system can't break most of it down at all. It passes through largely intact, which sounds useless until you realize what that uselessness actually does. Fiber slows down how fast the sugar sitting next to it gets absorbed. It also feeds the bacteria living in your gut, which is a big part of why fiber intake is tied to digestive health. So when a nutrition label says a food has 15 grams of carbohydrate, some portion of that is the sugar that will raise your blood glucose, and some portion is fiber that barely does. Most international health guidelines land on a fiber target of around 25 grams a day for adults. That number is not the same for everyone. It shifts with body size, with how much you eat overall, since fiber needs scale somewhat, with calorie intake, with age, and with activity level. Someone eating a lot of food to support a physically demanding lifestyle will naturally need more fiber than someone eating less. And it is worth saying clearly, this target is a general guideline for healthy adults, not a rule for everyone. People with certain digestive conditions, like inflammatory bowel disease or a sensitive gut that reacts badly to fiber, sometimes need to eat less fiber than this, at least during flare-ups on the advice of a doctor. So treat 25 grams as a reasonable default, not a number to force onto a body that is telling you otherwise. To put that target in perspective, a slice of typical white bread carries well under a gram of fiber. A slice of wholemeal bread lands around 2 grams, and a cup of cooked brown rice or a bowl of oats sits in the 3 to 4 gram range. 25 grams a day is a lot of slices. It is reachable, but only if vegetables, legumes, and fruit are doing most of the work, not grains alone. Here's the part that matters for the rest of this video. When a grain gets refined, the fiber is exactly what gets removed. That single fact explains almost everything about why white bread and brown rice, made from similar starting grains, act so differently once you eat them. Why refining grains changes everything. A whole grain, in its natural state, has an outer layer called bran, and a fiber-rich structure surrounding the starchy center. When a grain is refined, that outer layer is stripped away, and the remaining starch is often ground into fine flour. What you're left with is almost pure starch, with little to slow it down. Here is the chain of events that follows. You eat the refined carbohydrate. Because there's no fiber matrix to slow digestion, and often no protein or fat alongside it either, the starch breaks down into glucose fast and floods into your bloodstream in a short window. Your blood sugar spikes. Your body responds by releasing insulin, the hormone that clears glucose out of your blood and into your cells, and because the spike was sharp, the insulin response is sharp too. That often overshoots, pulling your blood sugar down below where it started. This is the crash, and a blood sugar crash produces two very recognizable feelings. Sleepiness, because your brain is temporarily running on a reduced glucose supply, and hunger, because a low blood sugar reading is one of the strongest hunger signals your body has. So an hour or two after the refined carb meal, you feel tired and you feel hungry again, even though you just ate. That is the spike crash cycle, and it is not a personal failing. It is basic physiology responding to how fast sugar entered your blood. Whole, unrefined versions of the same foods create a slower, flatter curve. because the fiber that's still intact physically slows down how fast digestive enzymes can access the starch. Brown rice, whole grain bread, oats, and potatoes with the skin left on are commonly recommended swaps for their refined counterparts, but I want to be precise here rather than pretend they're interchangeable. They are not equal in how much they blunt the spike, and there's a number that captures this. The glycemic index rates how fast and how far a food raises blood glucose, on a scale where pure glucose is 100. Published international tables put rolled oats around 55, brown rice around 68, wholemeal bread around 74, and boiled potato around 78 against white bread at about 75. Read those as approximate because they shift with variety, with ripeness, and with how the food is cooked. But the ordering is the useful part. Oats sit clearly lowest. Brown rice is meaningfully gentler than bread. Whole grain bread barely differs from white bread on this measure, partly because some whole grain labeled loaves are still mostly refined flour with a little whole grain added for marketing. And potato is the outlier that surprises people. Even with the skin on, cooked potato starch digests quickly, so it lands higher than brown rice or oats, skin or no skin. Keeping the skin on does add fiber and nutrients, and it's still an improvement over a peeled, mashed, or fried potato, but don't expect it to behave like oats. The honest takeaway is that unrefined is a spectrum, not a switch, and the size of the improvement depends on which specific food you're swapping. It's also important to say that switching to unrefined carbs is not a universal rule that applies the same way in every situation. There's at least one clear exception, around intense exercise. If you're about to do a hard workout, or you're recovering from one, a fast-digesting carbohydrate is actually useful, because you want that glucose available quickly for your muscles, not trickling in slowly. Athletes doing high-intensity training will sometimes deliberately choose faster carbs around training windows for exactly this reason. The slow, steady approach is the right default for most meals, most of the time. But it's not a moral rule that fast carbs are always bad. The other exception is digestive. Some people, particularly those with certain gut conditions, find that a sudden increase in fiber causes bloating, gas, or discomfort rather than steadier blood sugar. If that's you, the fix is usually to increase fiber gradually and choose sources your gut tolerates, not to force a big jump all at once, and to talk to a doctor if a health condition is involved. One more thing worth being upfront about. How strongly any given person's blood sugar responds to a given food varies enormously between individuals. Studies using continuous glucose monitors, small sensors that track blood sugar in real time, have shown that two people can eat the exact same meal and have very different blood sugar responses, sometimes for reasons researchers don't fully understand yet, including differences in gut bacteria, sleep the night before, stress, and genetics. This is still an active area of research, so everything I'm describing here is about general tendencies that hold true for most people most of the time, not a guarantee of exactly how your body will respond. If you want to know your own pattern precisely, that's what a glucose monitor or a conversation with a doctor is for. How to eat carbs without the roller coaster. Knowing the mechanism is only useful if it changes what you actually put on your plate, so let's get practical. The first lever is pairing. Eating a carbohydrate alongside fiber or protein slows down how fast that carb sugar hits your bloodstream, for the same physical reason that intact fiber inside a whole grain does. It physically and chemically interferes with how quickly your gut can access and absorb the sugar. This is why a piece of white bread eaten alone tends to spike blood sugar more than that same piece of bread eaten with eggs or with a side of vegetables. Fat has a similar slowing effect. This is a genuinely useful trick, but I'd be overselling it if I said it works identically for everyone. The size of the benefit depends on how much protein or fiber you actually add, on how insulin sensitive your body already is, meaning how efficiently it clears glucose out of your blood, and even on which specific carb you're pairing it with, since something at the very top of that glycemic scale, like plain sugar water, still spikes fast, even with some protein alongside it. Treat pairing as something that consistently helps, not something that fully cancels out a bad choice. The second lever is amount and frequency. A large amount of any carbohydrate, refined or not, will raise blood sugar more than a small amount, and eating large carb-heavy meals frequently throughout the day gives your blood sugar less time to return to baseline between meals. Spacing meals out and moderating portion size, especially for the more refined stuff, reduces how often you put yourself through the spike crash cycle. But again, how much this matters depends on the person. Someone who is very physically active, who walks a lot or trains regularly, tends to have better insulin sensitivity, that clearing efficiency again, so they can generally handle a larger carbohydrate portion with a smaller blood sugar response than someone who is sedentary. This is one of the real reasons physical activity matters for metabolic health, beyond just burning calories. So the right portion and frequency for you is not a fixed number. It's something that should shift based on your activity level and, if you know it, your own insulin sensitivity. The third lever is simply choosing less refined versions more often, which we covered in the last section. Understanding that the improvement size differs by food, and that fast carbs still have their place around intense exercise. Put together, a practical approach looks like this. Build most meals around a base of unrefined carbohydrates like oats, brown rice, or whole grain bread from a trustworthy source, rather than white bread, white rice, or pastries as your default. Add a source of protein and some fiber-rich vegetables to nearly every meal that includes carbs, which blunts the spike regardless of which carb you chose. Keep portions of the more refined stuff moderate, and don't stack multiple refined carb-heavy meals back-to-back in the same day. And recognize that these are general-purpose guidelines that work for most people most of the time, but your own body might respond differently, and that's worth paying attention to rather than ignoring. Key takeaways. Let's bring this together. Carbohydrate is really two things in one word: sugar and starch that raise your blood glucose, and fiber that barely does and actually slows the rest down. Refining a grain strips out that fiber, which is why refined carbs tend to spike blood sugar fast and crash it just as fast, leaving you sleepy and hungry again sooner than you'd expect. Unrefined versions like oats, brown rice, whole grain bread, and potatoes with the skin on soften that curve, but not by the same amount. On the glycemic index, oats sit around 55 while potato lands near 78, and whole grain bread is barely below white. And two practical tools: pairing carbs with protein and fiber, and managing portion size and meal frequency based on your own activity level, are the levers that actually move the needle day to day. None of this is about banning carbohydrates or treating a blood sugar spike as an emergency. It's about understanding a mechanism well enough to make it work for you instead of against you, while remembering that your own body's response is something worth learning about specifically, because the science here still has real individual variation left to explain. That's the whole picture for this one. Thanks for watching. If you like health claims explained with the reasoning and the citations behind them, consider subscribing to Why-Sided. The papers are always linked below so you can check the sources yourself. And there's plenty more here to keep exploring whenever you're curious.